Okie dokie. We're going to get started here in just a moment. I just want to make sure that everyone is in. It says we've got 2 watching at the moment. Just going to give it a few more minutes to make sure that everyone is here. But, little echo. Let me give myself a listen. Let me give myself a listen. Test, test, test. Okay, chill, chill. Okay, that looks like we've got everyone. And so, the first thing that I want to go through is the kind of text animation, because I think that this is like a really important skill for motion designers to know, because like obviously you're going to be doing a ton of text animation in your career. Like, you know, I think that there's no aspect of the industry, whether it's you're making titles or making broadcast graphics or doing promos or whatever, like text is such an important thing that not only good typography skills and understanding how typography works is important, but also being able to animate it correctly is really nice. And so we're just gonna look at some of the ways that I try to animate type in After Effects, and we can look at some of the ways that the important thing for me when I animate type is basically to be able to make an animation that is going to be okay if the type changes, right? And for me, that's very much a nature of my job, in that I do a lot of broadcast graphics that are a lot of kind of iterations and a lot of kind of repeating the same stuff over and over and over, and then having to change copy and having to like make, if you're doing a lower third or something like that, for instance, being able to you know, change the type in that lower third and have the animation still work and not have to rekey it and not have to do everything like that is I think such an important thing, and learning how to work procedurally and how to work in ways that you'll be able to update things later is just going to set you up for success as we move into making other things. So I'm going to go, okay, there's my screen. I'm going to see if I can get myself down there. Okay, hopefully that's not blocking anything. Cool. So what I have here, right, is this this comp with just this piece of type that says Mograph Mentor in it. And I think I may have said this in one of my first classes, but something that I want to talk about again is this is perhaps my absolute favorite shortcut in After Effects, hands down, is if you press Control Alt Home, it centers the anchor point on the layer that you've got. So you can see here that if I hit Command Z, the default text anchor point when you've got left align text is in this bottom left. But if you hit Control Alt Home, it sticks that anchor point in the center. And then the kind of combo shortcut that goes with this is just Control Home by itself centers whatever you have in your view, right? So those two things together are so helpful in terms of just like putting something in the center of your view. And it doesn't have to be just type, it can work with basically anything. So if I have a little solid thing, right, and I move it way over here off screen, I'm like, where the hell did it go, right? If I Command Home, Control Home, I just get that back in the center of my screen. And so that is really, really, really powerful, and I use this one all the time, and it's not super well documented, so I think it's helpful to point it out. Anyway, so I have some basic type here, and I'm not going to worry too much about the aesthetics of this type, but I am going to start talking about how to animate it. And the first thing that I think is helpful to do is just to talk about the entire concept of text animators, right? And if you guys have used After Effects before, this kind of concept of text animation is probably pretty straightforward, but I'm just going to take it slow and make sure that we go through all this because there's kind of a lot to cover. And so when you have a text layer, unlike a solid layer like this, you have this like kind of text group property that lives underneath it. And if you open that up, you get a certain amount of properties that kind of refer to the type. And so this first one, source text, is kind of the basic what the type says, right? So if I set a keyframe for source text here, and I move down and change this to something like hello, you'll see that I get a keyframe, and it's a square keyframe. It's a hold keyframe. And basically, at that moment in time, my text will change to being whatever the that new keyframe is, right? So a lot of people will use this to do write-ons, to do things like that. Something that I used to do when I was in school that I think is like it's perhaps a good example of what not to do, because it's it's very difficult to change, but I'll just kind of walk you guys through the process. Say you have a sentence like, this is a sentence, right? How I would often animate this was I would set the source text here, I'd go back a little bit in time, I would delete sentence, that sets a keyframe, I would go back a little bit in time, I would delete A, you get the point, right? Delete that, and then eventually come back here and delete this, right? And so that primitively, in a very kind of basic way, is how you can animate type on, right? This is a sentence. And so this is a good way to do this, but the problem is, like, say that I want to come here and I actually want this to be is A, right? The problem that happens is that in this case actually isn't going to, but let me change it to something that's not A. This is F, right? The problem that happens now is that you can see that I set a new keyframe, it's going to start popping, and then the F doesn't update here, right? So this is now A again. So even though I have F back here and I've changed it, the subsequent keyframes don't change, right? Because it's just taking the entire content of the text, each of those keyframe points. And so this is kind of a really straightforward way of animating type on, but A, it's just popping on, it's not very interesting. B, it becomes kind of a nightmare to update and edit. And then C, if I have to give this to somebody else, change the type, or do kind of cooler animation, right, like some kind of position move on or a scale up or a fade or something like that, I can't really do it here. It's not super helpful. So that's just kind of a very simple way to animate text, but I would not recommend doing it that way. If we come down here into path options, what we can do with path options is if we draw ourselves a mask on this layer, I just have B-splines open, is you can specify a path to put the type on, basically, right? So you can draw a mask on the layer and just do that, right? And then I think you've got some basic settings in here similar to type on a path, like in Illustrator or Photoshop, where you can do things like force the alignment so that it goes across the whole thing, shift it, etc., etc. So you can do animations like that as well pretty easily. Reverse path just kind of flips it to the other side. You can do perpendicular, which will kind of align them all vertically if you don't want them to kind of sit on the contour of the path. But this, like, type on a path is not something I do that often. I think depending on the work you do, it may come up, but that is pretty simple to do. You just draw a mask and put it on there. And then if you look in more options, right, these are some other things that we're going to want to look at as we get a little bit further down the line. But the important thing that's important to note here is that this grouping alignment, right? And so what you can see, let me zoom in so we can see it a little better, is that each of these letters has a little anchor point for itself, right? You have, if I click on the layer as a whole, I have this layer level anchor point that sits in the middle, but I also have letters for each of I also have anchor points for each of these letters, and I can basically shift that anchor point using these settings here. And so that might not seem immediately apparent why that's helpful, but when we get into the animators, this will make a lot of sense. So I'm just going to leave that at 0 right now. And so the way that we animate type in After Effects, almost always, how I would recommend we do it anyway, is you use these text animators that are right here, right? So when you click on this animate, it basically gives you a bunch of stuff that you can make text animators for, right? So these are your kind of transform properties. You've got things like tracking, character offset, color, etc., right? And so let's just pick a really easy one to start with, and let's just do scale. So what you'll see is when I clicked that and I clicked scale, it added this animator down here. It added something called a range selector, and it added a scale property. So the first thing that I would recommend that we do almost always is rename these animators, because eventually you'll end up with an animator 1, animator 2, and animator 3, and it just, you have no idea what's going on. So we're going to call this scale animator, right? And then what you'll see is if I just take this scale, you can see what's happening, right? The scale is affecting each letter uniformly, right? It's not scaling down the entire thing, you know, just for the sake of contrast. If I open up this transform and I find the scale parameter and I scale it, you can see that how this is behaving differently to this, right? This is on a per character basis, and this is on a layer level basis, right? It does the whole layer. So this is perhaps where we can go back and look at that more options thing. So there are things here where we can say anchor point grouping, character, word, line, or all. So let's see what happens if you go to word. The first thing you'll notice is that I only now have one anchor point for each of these words. And when I scale, when I use the scale animator to scale it down, you'll see that each word scales by itself now, right? So this is an easy way. If you need to do things word by word, you have the same property here for line or all, which are kind of self-explanatory. If you do line, it basically gives you that same thing, which is it scales line by line. But then if you have multiple lines, this will now scale each one independently like that, right? Cool. So, and then one more thing that I just breezed over really quickly that I think I want to talk about is one thing that drove me crazy in After Effects for such a long time is what will happen is you'll type some text, right? And then you're like, okay, I have this, but then I'm going to press V for move, but you realize that you start typing, right? And if I hit enter, it goes down to the next line, so I can type down here, right? So what a lot of people end up doing, right, is they like come down here and they click on a different layer, or they come, I'm just going to replicate it again. They'll come up here and they'll click on the move tool to kind of lock that text or to end the editing of it. But one thing that you can do is if you're on a full-size keyboard, basically there's a difference between enter and return, right? And on a Mac and a PC, the one that is left of the apostrophe is actually return, not enter. Enter is the one that sits on your numpad. And so what you'll see is that if I hit enter, the one by the numpad, it just confirms the type. And this is true for a lot of things inside After Effects, right? If I write an expression, right, enter goes down a line, return goes down a line, but enter confirms it, right? So get used to using that enter button on the numpad, is it makes a big difference in terms of just like not having to move your mouse as much and kind of go all over the place. Okay, sorry for that tangent, but going on. So now we've got some text, and then I'm going to do that trick that I just talked about. So center it, right? Move the anchor point to the center with Command Option Home, and then hit Command Home to center the whole thing in the window. And we're going to look again at this anchor point grouping. And so what you'll see presently is as I scale this down, lo and behold, this anchor point, or excuse me, this type is scaling from the very bottom, right? I'm going to change this back to characters so that we get a text. It's scaling from the very bottom where each of these anchor points are. And what you'll notice is that if I move this anchor point position to like something like -40 there, now you'll see that each character is scaling from its center, right? So you can use this to change the way that things scale, rotate, etc. Because sometimes you're going to want stuff to scale up from the bottom, sometimes you're going to want to scale it from the middle, sometimes you're going to want to rotate from a corner, etc., etc. So that is a really helpful two things, these anchor point grouping and the grouping alignment. So, and then something else that I'll just mention here as well is presently we're animating scale, but we can animate more things as well. If you click on this little add property And then you can add something like rotation, for instance, right? And this is going to behave the same way. It's going to rotate each character independently based on each character's anchor point. And you'll see that now as I move this anchor point perhaps on the Y, now I'm going to the top left corner or so. When I click this, when I change this rotation, you'll see now that they rotate from the corner, right? So you can do some cool swinging text animations like that, right? Cool. So then this is all fine and dandy, but like obviously again, how do I animate something like this? I'm just gonna reset this back to 100. How do I animate something like this in a way that's a little bit more interesting? I'm gonna actually put this back to where we had it before as well, so they're kind of in the middle. And the way that we do that is this range selector. And I have a lot of qualms with the range selector, but it is kind of our best tool for animating type. And if you guys have used effectors in Mograph in Cinema 4D, it's not a super different concept, right? And so I'm just going to walk through how this works, and then we'll talk about some of the more intricate parts, right? So if I set this scale down to 0, right, my whole text disappears as you'd expect. And currently you see this range selector says 0 to 100, right? And I'm just going to take this bottom value and move it up. And what you'll see, right, is that each character then gets animated on from left to right. And how this basically works is that there is a little, you can see this little vertical bar right here. And how this is working, essentially everything left of that vertical bar, the start bar, is not affected by the parameters that you have down here. And everything right of this end bar, the same idea, is not affected. So you can see that this scale property of 0 is only being applied between the start and the end value, right? So you can use these animators here to animate text coming on. So like something we'll do very often is like I'll just set a keyframe here for start. I'll come over to 1 second. I'll move that forward. I'm going to shorten up my comp time just so it plays a little bit better. And then if I play, now I kind of have this animation that each kind of character goes on, right? And then so the cool thing that happens here that's really interesting is a couple of things. Why this is powerful, let's talk about the different components. The first thing, this is a %, right? This is totally, so I can change this to test text 04, right? And now, because we're just going 0 to 100%, the entire animation still works. Could you, for example, have delays between each character word line? Yes, we will. We'll get there. That's like where this is all building up to. I think that that's like one of the most obfuscated, hard to find things in After Effects. So we're gonna walk through how we basically like customize this to be a little more interesting. So, but just bear with me for a moment. And then, so the other thing that is worth noting as well is that you have an offset, which basically just shifts the entire set of text. So if I, for instance, take this 0 to 25, right, I've got nothing here where it should be. And then if you move the offset, right, it just kind of moves that whole section to the right or to the left, depending if you go forward or negative. So that's cool. That's super helpful, and I would say that just the fact that these are keyframes that are based on a % and not like a numerical value makes it a lot easier to play with. And then you can just, of course, obviously, just like anything else, you can ease these keyframes, and the whole animation is then going to be a little cooler, right? So if you... Bam, got it. So that's cool. So then let's explore a couple of these different guys really quickly, and what you'll notice as well here is that, as I mentioned before, when we put scale there, you can also do things like, let's just do position for the time being. So I'll move these things down, right? So now what's happening is not only are they scaling up, but they're also moving up from the bottom, as you can see, right? And I'm just actually going to re-ease that keyframe a little bit in so that we have a little bit more build. So then, yeah, so you can see that these are all, if I play it, right, they're coming up from the bottom like that. And let me stretch this out just so we can see it. right? And now, so both of those properties are animating in tandem, right? You've got this this position and the scale that are happening at the exact same time. And so one of the first questions that often comes up is, how do I animate these different properties independently, right? And so the way that you do that is, remember how we have this animator. I'm going to just take the position property out. Is if we come back and click on this type layer and come back to animate, we can then make an entire new animator. You see that this thing came down here and now it says animator 1, and I could simply rename this animator. A mistake that happens here pretty often is that if you try and add something while you have an animator selected, so say I come here, click animate, click skew or something, it adds it to that animator that you have selected, which you might not want. So if you need to make a new animator, you come up and click on the type here to add that new guy. And so what you'll see is that I still have my scale animation happening, right? Totally fine, because that's based on that other animator. And now what I can do is I can take this range selector and use those keyframes for guidance maybe, but maybe I want this to be a little bit delayed, right? Maybe I want to take this and they'll appear, sit for a moment, and then slide up, right? So I'm just going to blah, 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 ease that out. And I don't know the keyboard shortcuts on a PC. Easy ease in. And so now what you'll see is that presently they're going to look exactly the same because they're animated at the same, but I can now take these keyframes and slide them over, and you'll see what happens now is my T will scale up, it'll sit for a few minutes, and then it will start to move up, right? So you can layer these animators in a really cool way that will allow you to make very complicated, intricate animations with just a few simple properties. And I think that, you know, maybe you guys are starting to kind of get my whole thing about motion graphics is like, it's all a bunch of very tiny, simplistic components that are just layered on top of each other to create complexity, right? And so I would say that, hey, you guys didn't tell me that my thing was blocking the whole thing. I'm sorry about that. We're moving it up there. So hopefully you can see a little bit better now, and if there's any questions, please let me know. I'm just gonna turn that off. I don't think we need it right now. So anyway, yeah, so I'll just run through that really quickly again in case anybody missed it, right? How you do it is you start with your layer, you click animate, you click the property that you want to animate, so scale. You set this to the start value that you want it to be, right? So my start value is going to be at 0 scale. You then use the range selector to set keyframes, changing that range, right? Which is really helpful. And so now again, I just really quickly recreated that that kind of right on animation. Hopefully that's a little easier to see. Some more things that I think we need to talk about is what happens is inside this range selector, we also have a ton of other options when we twirl down this advanced, right? We have the same kind of based on characters, words, lines that we had up in this more options thing. So we can actually have different we can actually have different animators operating on different things. We could have a scale that's operating on character by character, but a position that's operating word by word, right? So you can do it on an animator by animator basis. The other thing that you have that can sometimes be really helpful, sometimes be a nightmare, is you can change this from percentage to index, right? And so what this is doing is instead of giving me 0 to 100, it's now giving me 0 to 12, and that happens to be because there are 12 characters there, right? 4 plus a space is 5, 4 plus a space is 5, so that's 10, 11, 12, right? And as I change this thing, for instance, if I change it to words, you'll notice that nothing is going to change, but I can now take this down, and if I do 1, it's going to be 1 word. If I do 2, it's going to be 2 words, and then the third word, etc. Okay, let me check this out. Alex and Travis, are you guys having any playback issues? I'll drop the video bit rate just a tiny bit, so that we can hopefully it's not quite as heavy for you there, Chris. But again, the beauty of the YouTube stuff is that it's going to be recorded, so if you miss some stuff now, feel free to go back and check the VOD when it's done. My apologies about that. So, but anyway, so if we have this index property, right, so now I can do things like I can animate. Let's say I go and I find, what did we say? It was 12, right? The problem that happens here is that this all looks fine and dandy right now, right? It's all no problem, is that we're going from 0 to 12, which is working. And if I go back to characters, it'll actually do it properly. So each character is 0 to 12. The problem that happens here is what happens if I then change this to a shorter word like hello, right? The whole thing is now done animating here, right? Whereas I theoretically wanted it to come all the way out to the very end. Whereas if this is on percentage again, and I come over here and I go to 100, this takes 1 second. If I change this back to hello, this will also take 1 full second to animate, right? So you can use this to keep animations consistent even when you're excuse me, I just totally brain farted. You can use it to keep animations consistent even when you change the type. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to keep it on percentage at the moment. And so something else that we're going to talk about a little bit later is a lot of these easing in this shape, because this is kind of what Travis was getting at is going to happen, where you can kind of change the way that these characters animate and the way that they blend and delay and things like that. But the ones down here that are kind of basic and helpful is something like randomize order, right? Which just is exactly like what it says. It just gives you the characters or lines or words or whatever you've chosen this part as in a random order. And again, because if I make this longer text, right, then I'll center it up. This is going to do the same thing. It's going to change in the different a random order, right? So there's that. If I turn off random order, sometimes what you want as well is, rather than this kind of gradual scale up that you've got this very basic smoothness property here, which just essentially changes how choppy the animation is. So if I set this to 0 smoothness, you'll see that now there's no scale up whatsoever. I'm going to turn those guides off. Gonna turn those off. You'll see that there's no scale up whatsoever, and they just pop on. Whereas if I go back to 100, you can see there that it pops up, and you've got this that scale up animation. These easing properties are essentially, we're going to talk about these in a minute, but essentially these are the ease out, which is this, and the ease in for each of these characters. So if I just crank the ease so we can see, what you'll see is the whole thing is going to feel a lot snappier, right? Like that ease is far more heavy. We've really crushed those curves. And so you can use these to a certain extent to give you the to change the type of the animation that you have. And so what this is maybe a little bit more evident in, is with position, where we've got a larger range. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add position. I'm going to come down here and move this way down. Right, and so now we're basically having this animation as it goes up. And if we set these eases back to 0, you'll see that each of the animations is extremely linear, right? Whereas if we start to, let's maybe just ease the ease out, right? So now what happens, or excuse, I guess I got it backward. This is the ease in, but you'll see that it takes a moment to settle when it gets to the very top. And then the same thing is if I crank that up, now you'll see that it kind of sticks to the bottom, right? It heavily eases out before it goes up. So these are not always that helpful, but they can change your animation a little bit depending on what you're doing. So, and then you can also take these to negative, right? Which is going to change them the opposite of ease, right? More and more linear, more and more steppy. So, okay, that is cool. I'm trying to think of what else we want to talk about here. before we get into the kind of shapes. And I guess we'll just move right into that. And so the biggest issue with this here, and even if I come into this advanced situation and I like take the eases and I really play with them, is the problem that happens here, right, is it kind of animates one character at a time. So G is happening, then E, and you can see that there's maybe one frame here where they're both moving, but as a whole, it's going each character by each character, and that sometimes is what you want. Other times you want it to be a little bit more fluid or even or gradual or whatever. And so the way that you can do that, right, is by using these different shapes that we have here. And so what I'm going to do is first I'm going to kill that keyframe, and I'm going to change this shape from square to ramp up, right? And what you'll see immediately is when I set my start back to 0, is that this creates this kind of ramp. And sorry to jump around like this. I'm just going to reset the easing. Actually, you know, for the sake of cleanliness, I'm just going to make that whole animator over. So I'm going to add a position. I'm going to move the position down. So that's my start state. I'm going to come into the advanced, and I'm going to change the shape to ramp up. So now what you'll see, right, is that no longer is all of this type appearing at the bottom and then moving up. You can see that there's been a bit of a shape, and in this case ramp up, right, meaning that the amount of position change applied to each character increases as the type goes over. If we do something like triangle, you'll see very evidently that that becomes a triangle, right? And so we can change the way that the our quote-unquote effector, our range selector, affects the type. And so ramp up is one of the ones that we'll use pretty often. And so what happens here, though, is that this really bothered me for a long time. Is what I'd come to hear something like this. I'd click a start keyframe, and then I'd move to end, and I would move this forward, just the same thing we kind of did. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. And we're getting a little bit more. As you can see, we have a couple things moving at the same time there. Right, we've got a couple, you can see the L, the I, and the N all kind of overlap, but the problem is I have this L that's coming up there, and it's starting at the wrong position, right? I want the L to be lower. And so what you often do, or what I often used to do, is that I would do it in two sets, right? I would take this N property down, I would come up all the way over here, and then what I would do is I would just offset these keyframes, right? And so now you'll see that I have this kind of animation that as I play it, right, is going to give you this situation that's a little bit more fluid. But as we can see here, trying to animate these two things to be perfectly in sync is always really hard. And like when I was here, I got this weird like lag that was happening, and when I offset them less, it moves too fast, and these are a little bit difficult to behave, or to make behave. So what I would suggest that we do is, instead of using each of these range selector, the start and the end, so I'm just going to set this back to its default state, which is 0 to 100, we can actually offset the entire ramp, right? And so what you'll see is if I take this offset and I start moving it left, basically if you imagine there being like, sorry, I'm just gonna try and demonstrate this really quickly. If you imagine there being like a ramp that looks kind of like that, right? If you imagine that happening when we have this at 0, looks pretty accurate actually. And is what will happen is I move this back, is essentially this ramp gets slid back like this, right? And so this is no longer affecting the type over here, because this ramp has now you kind of left the type, and it's no longer having any effect over it. So what you can do actually is you can take this offset all the way from -100, set a keyframe, go to frame this, and then go up to 100, and what you'll see is that just like with very minimal effort, I'm getting nice type easing that is with 2 keyframes and really easy to control. And so now what I can do is I can come in here, ease out that keyframe. I can come in here, ease in that keyframe, play with my curves, right? And then now I've got kind of a jump that goes up, right? And the other thing that we can do here as well is we still have these ease high, ease low options here. So I think what I want to do is I want to take the ease high all the way up. So that's the ease out, right? And so now what you'll see is I have this jump where it kind of slowly eases out and then snaps up. I can do the reverse, which would be set the ease low to 100, and what I'll get now is the opposite. It'll jump up and kind of slowly slide in, right? Bam. That is looking pretty good to me, right? And so I can use this to create more interesting, kind of nicer type animation. And if I wanted then to play with the way that these are working, I can, you know, tweak these different eases so that it's even, if I take this one to -100, it's going to be even snappier, right? Like it just basically teleports up half the screen, but then kind of eases slowly into place like that, right? And so if I come here and I set a mask, Command-Shift-N, right, I automatically have this text animation, right? Done, easy. And then what you can do with situations like this is to kind of what we were doing, what Alex was asking about earlier, is to animate one piece of type to another, is if I duplicate this piece of type and I change it to second type, center it up, I'll get those guys back there for you, get that, and then so but basically what's happening here now is I've got 2 things with keyframes that I can just very easily offset, right? So what's going to happen is not going to work exactly here, but essentially that type is going to come up. Sorry, this layer's turned off. This type is going to come up, and then the second type is going to come up as well, right? And so our goal here is what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and transition between these 2 pieces of type, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first piece of type here, this longer line of type, and bam, I've animated it on that way, right? And so I'm now going to do the exact same thing to animate it off. I'm going to animate position. I'm going to move the position up like that, right? I'm actually going to delete this second type layer just so that we can keep it a little bit cleaner. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. We're going to go back to our range selector. And the other cool thing that happens here as well is that you can toggle these animators with this little eye the same way that you would do a layer, right? So if I don't want animator 1 to affect my layer right now because I'm not working on it, I can just straight up turn it off. And then I'll also, just for the sake of it, I'll change this mask to none so that it's not, even though there's still a mask here, it's no longer actually doing anything to my type. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into this range selector and I'm going to change the mode from ramp up to ramp down, and then I'm going to basically animate it the exact same way, right? So I'll take my offset from -100, come a little bit later, and go to +100, right? Then if I turn my mask back on, and I want to, what did I do the other one? I think I eased it high. Ease high, -100, we're going to set that to 0, and ease low 100. So I'm just going to come to this ease low and crank it. I will then re-enable my mask, and now what you'll see is that I get, when I turn my first animator back on, what you'll see is I'll get this type that comes in and then goes away, right? And that was pretty easy to do, and I can offset these keyframes further if I wanted to. You know what I might actually do is instead of re-easing them, I might just copy them and paste them there, right? So now I've got this kind of, bam, comes up and goes away, and I can move this over if I want them to sit longer. Got it. And then so now if I duplicate this and I change, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these over. Right, I think I need a little more. Actually, I don't need a little more time. I'm just gonna compress the keys, right? So maybe that's a little too much. I am gonna just extend it. Okay, also another really great shortcut that I can talk about here is that basically really quick ways to jump in and out of your timeline and your view panel is, so something that happened here, right, that I just did is I extended my composition time, and you can see that that happened because now I have this slider that's over here. And so sometimes you do this, and some people use this little slider down here, some people use this guy to kind of change it. There's a really helpful shortcut to navigate your timeline, and it's actually a weird one, and that shortcut is actually semicolon. And so what happens is if you hit semicolon, the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to take you down to a 1 frame by 1 frame view. And then if you hit it again, it's going to take you out to your entire timeline view. You can see that it moved me all the way out here. So if I come back and say that I'm like tweaking these keyframes down here and want to see the whole thing, if I hit semicolon twice, it just zooms me all the way back out to the top level of the comp. The same thing is if I come to this keyframe, hit semicolon, now I can edit this keyframe on like a 1 by 1 basis. You can also use, if you want, you can use shift semicolon to just zoom out rather than having to hit it twice. But that's a really helpful shortcut in that it gives you this ability to kind of jump into really fine time scale and then jump out to full view really quickly. So I'm now just going to take these layers and I'm going to extend them to the end of the comp. Oh, and also the same thing works in the viewport, but instead of semicolon, you use /. So if I'm way out here and I hit /, it's going to take me, as you can see here, to 100%, right? And I can use Control Command minus to go different sizes. And the one that I absolutely love is if you hit Shift/, it's going to basically do this fit, right? So it's going to show me as large as my viewport is at the moment. So oftentimes I'll come down here to like draw a big ass mask or something like this. Shift/ brings you back to full view. I need to see this at 100%. Hit / zoom in. Then Shift/ to go back, right? And so these are just, again, probably like shortcuts that aren't going to revolutionize the way that you work, but it's this kind of like being able to jump around and stay agile that is going to make your life a lot easier, right? Okay, so moving on. So now that we've got this kind of text animation that we've got there, I'm going to now duplicate this layer and slide it over. And what you'll see immediately is that I get this repeat, right? And so I'm going to find the moment where these guys are kind of like that, and then I'm going to try and line these up. Bam. Something like that, right? So now they kind of, yeah, nice. And so I can then come here to the second line of text, double click it and say second line, right? Center it up. And I think I moved my thing. So now what happens is I get, bam, look at that. And there's only like four keyframe properties to get this to happen, right? And it happened really quickly. And you can obviously do this with a lot of different things. Position works quite well, but you can do opacity, you can do character offset, you can basically do any of these things where we'll, using this shape instead of being square, to setting it to ramp and then animating that offset is a really helpful tool. And like, I'm gonna tangent for a moment here, but like what I used to do, right? And this is like something that I would recommend everyone check out is this site called motionscript.com, and or motionscript, maybe it's not .com. I think I spelled it wrong. Motionscript.com. This is Dan Ebert's, right? He's an old After Effects guy. Like he has been writing expressions for a really long time, but he has this really long tutorial that if we come down here, he's basically got these animations for doing this kind of like parametric offsetting, but like you have to write all this code and you have to use these different expressions and like everything else. I remember when I found out this shape, changing that stuff to ramp up, I was like, oh, thank the Lord, this is so much easier. Okay, so now just a couple more things let's take a look at before we jump into some of the other questions. So I'm going to have a new type, center it, and we can also, you know, center the anchor point so it writes from the middle. So there's a couple other things that I just want to go through really quickly before we jump onto the other stuff. So let's do that same thing where we've got position, for instance. right? And we're going to move this position down. And then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to delete this range selector, right? So now this position is just affecting all of the type uniformly. But what we can do is if we click on this animator and we use this add, there's other selectors that we can get down here, right? And the expression one is a little bit advanced, so we're not going to talk about that right now, but sometimes what can be helpful is this wiggly selector, right? And so what the wiggly selector does is, I'm not sure if you guys have used wiggles in After Effects before, but essentially it just kind of randomly animates each of those characters, right? It just randomly moves them around, very much like a random effector in C4D, right? And you have a bunch of different parameters down here that are, you know, wiggles per second, the based on that we were talking about, the max and the mins, very identical to a cinema Mograph effector. And so what I can do for an instance here is I can keyframe this max and min. I can come forward in time, set these to 0, and then when I play this, we'll have this kind of settling animation, right? So you can use this wiggly selector to, if you just need kind of random sporadic animation. What I can do here as well is then I can just start layering these different properties. So let's like add some scale, why not? Right? And so now what you'll see is as I go through, we'll get big type and crazy type, you know, doing all kinds of stuff. And I'm going to lock dimensions there so that they don't skew. Why not? Let's go with rotation as well, right? So now we can take this crazy type and just kind of settle it. And then so this might be a situation where I want to move that anchor point so that they behave a little better. Move it up. And yeah, and then you have a random seed that you can play with to get different animations. You can change it all using these different properties, etc. So I would say that spending some time with these different animators and looking how that they animate your type is very similar to kind of what we covered the other day with the shape layers, right? And actually, why don't we just dive into that really quickly? If we make a shape layer, we can then add our ellipse. We can add a fill. That's a stroke, but it'll do. The other thing that we have here as well is we also have these wiggles. This is the thing that I want to talk about here, is that we have something called a wiggle transform, which is essentially going to do the exact same thing that we just looked at, right? Is I can tell it how much I want it to wiggle. So let's just say, let's put the position there. And now you can see that, excuse me, if I play this, I'm now just getting this wiggly shape, which you might be like, whatever, I can do that with a single keyframe for my ellipse. But this also then behaves with all of these other really cool things inside of the shape layer. So we can then do a repeater, right? And if we move this over, what you'll see presently is that they're all going to animate the same, but then if I put this repeater above the wiggle transforms, we'll get 3 different kind of wiggly shapes. And now I can just really quickly make a bunch of these. Bam, got it, right? Like now I have a whole screen of these kind of moving around spheres really, really quickly, and then I can go back into this wiggle transform. Maybe it's going a little fast. Maybe I want to actually scale it as well. -100. And so now I'm getting this kind of cool abstract wiggly thing. And so there's the wiggle transforms, but the last thing that I'll also mention here just before we move on is that there's the wiggle paths, which will do essentially the same thing, but you'll see that it actually just jankifies the entire path, right? So you can put this in there, you can kind of change the size and the detail and like basically how much it's working. I didn't like that. But there's like a smoothness thing, I think. Point smooth, yeah, you change it to smooth, and then maybe you change the size to be a little bit smaller, not larger. And we'll take the detail to like there, right? And so now what I'm getting is not only am I getting movement in the, and I'm going to take these wiggles up, right? not only am I getting movement in the position, the transform properties from this wiggle transformer, but I'm also getting these really cool, you know, blipping things or whatever that are happening there. And so I'm gonna take this. I don't need 105, so maybe 2. So now that path is moving, and I think if I turn off the transforms, it'll be a little bit easier to see that wiggle pass. And what I'll maybe do is I'll take the detail down and then take the size up. Yeah, so you can see there that I've got some really kind of basic path wiggling that's happening, and this just works on spheres, but obviously whatever type you put there will be just fine. And then what you can do, again, just layering stuff on top. Now I've got these kind of abstract things that I could find different effects, like maybe posterized time, which just kind of makes this whole thing look a little, and I'm going to change this to like 6. And basically what this does is it just drops your frame rate. So now I'm going to get this kind of choppy looking thing, and maybe if I go up to like 15, which is oftentimes what like hand-drawn animation is done at, I now have something that's going to feel a little bit hand-drawn, even without me actually having done that, right? Because you have this kind of path wiggle, you have this kind of stutter, low frame rate quality, you have a very organic animation that is built just like immediately with these shape layers, right? So again, this is basically just like layering complexity, right? Like you start with something very simple like a circle, right? You layer these wiggling properties, you layer these different path things, you layer these different effects on top of it, you know, whatever. Let's keep going, right? Let's put echo on it, and we'll get these like trails that go behind the shapes, right? And I can up this. So now I have these kind of weird, and I can set there's a fade property here somewhere, decay. Where's the decay? Must not have been it. Right, so now if I up the decay and change the starting intensity to something lower, I now get this kind of fade that's happening, right? And so this will now let me RAM preview it instead of playing it. Just take a second. But now I have this like very basic kind of like traced animation that's happening, and again, very little work that I did. In fact, there are 0 keyframes, right? I have a ton of motion, a ton of different components that are coming all together, and I didn't even set a keyframe, right? So I'm gonna take this down so it plays a little faster. I don't know why it's going so slowly. Am I doing something in the background it doesn't like? That's possible. Okay, we're doing a little better now. But just if I just play this 1 second, you'll see that, you know, I'm getting this kind of weird, I don't even know what you would call this, like furball or microbe cellular level thing or whatever. I think it's kind of cool, and like this kind of stuff just gets me really excited, right? And I think in a lot of ways it's just kind of dumb. These are just like stupid little spheres moving around the screen, but this idea of building from something that's very simple and keeping a system, right? You have this tool built that I can really come in here and change these different pieces, right? If I don't like that wiggle, I can move it. If I want them to rotate at the same time, I just crank this up, right? It's just very easy for me to build these rigs, these tools, these systems that I can then edit, modify, iterate upon very, very quickly. And so I would say that, you know, when you're approaching how to build something, think about it that way. Think about it, what's the most simplistic, basic step that I can take, and then how do I layer other things on top of it to make that a little bit better. So, cool. I am going to... okay, so Alex had posted another question earlier about animating or automating parameters offset within a repeater. i.e. opacity builds up from first shape to the last or anything in sequential order. So this, for opacity specifically, we have something very helpful here. This is not always easy to do otherwise, right? And I think that this is where oftentimes the limitation of the shape layers effect, or the shape layers tool, comes in. And so we're going to talk about it in just a moment, but this is oftentimes, believe it or not, where like something like using cinema can be extremely powerful. Just one moment, sorry. Okay, cool. Using something like cinema can be extremely powerful. So I'm going to take my ellipse, I'm going to stroke it, and I'm going to maybe make the stroke a little bit thicker. And then I might take the size of the ellipse down so I have this kind of dot. Command-Shift-H to hide the bounding box. Right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my repeater and essentially do what I just did. Right, I've got this. And so what you'll see is in this transform repeater is that you have this default opacity slider, right? So you can change the start and the end opacity that happens there. So you can do things like maybe these are both 0, right? And then in a couple seconds this comes up, and then a little bit later this comes up or whatever. And then we'll ease these. And now I kind of get that fade, and I can stagger it to be a little bit further if I want. So this kind of beginning will appear, and then the end will come in. So you can use that to do opacity. But the other thing that's worth noting here for other properties that aren't opacity is that if we understand how the repeater works, we can use this to kind of create other types of those kind of gradual transforms as well. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, cool. And so what we can do, right, is if I just to make this easy, if I go back to this being plane, right, and I change this offset to now not only have an X position, but if I also give it a Y position, you'll see, right, that each of these different ones is being animated based on the previous one. So I start with 0, then I go -50, -100, -150, -200, right? So if I then put this back to being kind of centered, right, I can then do things like animate them back to being in a straight line by just canceling that out, right? So I can kind of have them be really spaced out like this. I'll set a keyframe there. And then I will set a keyframe back at 0. And those will kind of come back to rest. And then you can try as well to use things like scale to animate the different properties. But as you can see, this is automatically kind of giving us problems because it's going to like start to make some of them really big and some of them really kind of small. And you could do things like maybe, for instance, like where you'd animate these two properties. So maybe at the beginning you've got 0 clones and 0 whatever, so that as this kind of comes, they kind of do this like weird little angle swoop or whatever. That's kind of cool, right? Okay, but the other things that I think might be, I'm trying to think if there's anything else here that would be really beneficial. Let's look at how we would do this in cinema, right? Because oftentimes stuff like that it's just begging for Mograph in a lot of ways. It's just begging to be to use these different effectors in ways that are really cool. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump into C4D and we're going to look at how to build something like that and how to render it in kind of a 2D quality. And the last thing that I'll say is that shape layers in After Effects by default do have that continuously rasterized turned on because they are vector, right? So if I scale this way up, it stays super nice and crispy. But if I pre-comp this, I actually don't know how this is going to work with its being in its own comp. If I pre-comp this and move it up, you can see now that it does rasterize. So if I pre-comp it, I want to check on continuously rasterize, or actually becomes collapse transformations with this pre-comp to keep it crisp. But when it's by itself, it's very much like a piece of type where you don't have to, or rather when you type it, that thing just comes default. It's vector because After Effects is just calculating it. So here we go. What we're going to do, right, we're going to do the same thing that we were starting with. We're going to do a tube. I'm going to bring this radius in so that it kind of looks more like what we were dealing with in our After Effects example. Something like that. Maybe I will even fillet it. Right, so now bam, got that. And then again, this is probably going to be pretty straightforward for anyone who's played around with Mograph a little bit, but just for the sake of kind of demonstration, we'll just go through building it, right? So I'm going to hold Option and click on a cloner that's going to put the tube in the cloner. I'm going to change this from linear to grid array, right? Which copies do I want? I don't want any in the Y. I don't actually want any in the Z either. And now I can basically just like, I basically have that shape layer, right? In a lot of the same ways. I have this thing that's created clones that behave in kind of an outward, center out kind of situation, right? Let's crank that back up. Crank this back up too. But let's talk about like what we can do in Cinema that we can't do in After Effects, right? And so let's talk about the kind of left to right animation. I think we talked about this last week a little bit, or whenever, a couple weeks ago. But let's essentially add that plane effector, right? Then we're going to do a position not on Y, but let's do, because we're looking on the blue axis, which is Z, right? We're going to kind of start from down here, change our fall off to being linear. We're going to rotate our effector. Actually, I'm not going to rotate it. I'm trying to get into a habit instead of rotating, instead of changing the orientation here, because this and basically what this means, right? If you don't use this orientation thing a lot, is that basically it's like which way is it pointing, and plus Z basically means that the arrow is pointing in the positive Z, right? This is positive Z, this is negative Z, and so if I want the arrow to point this way, I'll just change that to positive X, right? And that just does, and it moves it. It just rotates it, but as you can see, if I go into the coordinates little tab thing, there's no actual rotation there. Not a big deal, really, but we'll kind of keep things tidier if you end up doing complicated things. I digress. Anyway, what we can do is now the same thing that was happening basically with that range selector in After Effects, right? I can just move this and pull these different, and each of the different rings will be affected based on where this fall off is, right? The benefit of this too is that I have things like this range where I can pull this out to make them more gradual. This is just doing a lot of stuff like far easier in my opinion, right? Like this is just inherently giving you a much easier render, much easier animation. Then there are also things here like where you can even add a fall off of the spline, right? So if I do that, again, holding control to add these 2 points, right? If I kind of set that, actually let me go to a preset. If I go to linear, right, this is exactly what it was giving me before, in that I kind of have this linear fall off from here to here, but I can now, but I definitely can change this, right? I'm gonna go back to where I had the handles, but then I can take these handles, right, and I can start to pull these out so that I'm getting maybe a more drastic animation, right? So now when I have these handles, they're going to zip up really quickly, and as you can see, as I move this guy, it's a little bit more severe, and you can see that it's in a lot of ways creating that same kind of S shape that we're mirroring over there. So let's animate this, right? We'll start down here. Excuse me. What we actually want to do as well is we want to flip this, right? Instead of being plus Y, we're going to do minus Y so that we can start over here on the left and move this over. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put this here, position, coordinates, X position, come a little further in time, let's say 2 seconds, and move our dude to where it ends, which is like right there. So now easy animation, got it. They're zipping up, right? But what can we do on top of this now? Like, how can we make this a little bit cooler? And so I'm just going to kind of start throwing some stuff out there to try and make something cool. If anyone has any specific things that you'd like me to stop and cover a little bit more, please just slow me down. But so one of the coolest things I think about Mograph is it's almost cheating. It's so easy, right? Is there's this cool thing if you go over here to Mograph effector and then you go to the delay effector. Basically what this does, and you'll see when I start it doesn't really do anything that noticeable. But when I click on it and I go to the effector tab, you'll see that I have these different modes, right? And essentially what this is doing is it's smoothing, it's blending my entire animation. If I move this all the way to the right to being really strong, you'll see what happens is that the entire animation just gets smoothed out, right? You can use this delay effector to take a really jagged animation and smooth it. You know, I'm just going to show you a quick example of something that this can be used for. Is if I make a new scene, sphere, smaller, Mograph, hold option, put it in a cloner, let's make a grid array, right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to take a effector, we're going to take a random effector, got these things here, and then instead of animating any of those parameters, I'm going to actually animate the seed, right? So each time I change this, these are going to move around. And so I'm going to take this seed and just like, that's probably too many, move it there. And so if I play this at the moment, control, it's hard working on two different pieces of software, is you'll see that I just get, oh, it's not, I didn't realize it was a float. So if I'm going to set this to 1 here, I'm going to go to 15 frames, set it to 2, go to 30 frames, set it to 3, 45, 4. There's probably an easier way to do this. I should think about this. And then here we're 7. And then so what I want to do now is that these are still going to blend pretty easily, which I don't really want. So I'm going to come into my timeline. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so we can see it. I'm going to come into my F curves mode just so that it makes sense. I'm going to hit H to put these all in my thing. I'm going to select them. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the spline interpolation to step. Right? And so this is literally like hold keyframe. So what this is going to do now is you're going to see that it's going to basically pop from one position to the other. But let's just take a blend effector, or excuse me, a delay effector, and stick it on top. And what you'll see now is like, look, you were starting to get a little bit of motion as those things happen, right? Can you use an effector to change opacity? Kind of. You can actually do that a little bit. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. So now by putting this delay here, and maybe I'll take that down a little bit so that it, or actually up. Right, now you can see that this animation that was completely steppy, right, if I turn this off, it just pops from one state to the other, is now being blended, and I have this really easy strength parameter to kind of change how that blending happens, right? So that's the blend effector is like so cool. And one of the really cool things that it does too is you can change this mode from blend to something like spring, and if I crank that, what you'll see is that, let's look at it without first so we can remember. If this is how the base animation is, these kind of slide up. If I change this to spring, you'll see what happens is I get this like woo, like this crazy wobble, right? And I can use that, and I can now just change this parameter here to kind of change the amount of overshoot I'm getting. So I'm getting this really easy animation that now has this additional kind of overshoot and things like that as well. So then what we're going to do is maybe I don't want them to be down here kind of on. Maybe I also want a scale to happen, right? And so what I might do is I'm going to call this plane pos for plane position. Then what I might do is I might come to my cloner, I might go to Mograph, make a new plane effector and call this like plane scale, right? And then what I want to do with this guy is set the parameter not to move the position, but to scale this uniformly to -1, which is going to hide them, right? Cool. Then we might do the same thing here where we come with a linear fall off and we change this to -x. And so now again, as we move this, these things appear. But what we can do too on top of that is we can make these children of each other, right? So I can set this, since I've already animated this plane guy, I can come here, hit Shift-C, PSR to reset it, and now really easily, and this is going to look very good, but it'll demonstrate the point, is that now I have kind of scale and position happening at the same time, right? Now I can adjust these two things. Maybe I don't want them to happen exactly at the same time. Maybe I'll offset it a little bit so that they scale up just a little bit before they move, right? And so now I have this animation, bam, where they kind of scale up and then appear over there, right? Something that I want to look at here really quickly is if I turn off this plane position, right, what you'll notice is that these guys just scale up, right? That entire little delay that we had happening isn't happening on them anymore. And why is that happening? And it's because if we go to our cloner and we come to this effectors tab, the delay is actually being calculated before the scale, right? So if I take this delay and I move it to the bottom, hopefully it's moving fast enough, but you'll see, I don't know if you can see it, but no, let me crank it a little bit so we can, you can see it there, but if I make it even higher, you'll tell that these really now wobble, right? Look at those guys, they're totally wobbling. And so you do actually need to check the order that your effectors are in. So if you want the delay to be affecting the scale as well, you're going to need to make sure the delay comes after. Cool, so I'll re-enable that. Look, now I have this kind of cool scale up and then they move over really quickly. Bam, got it. And so then how might we, I haven't forgotten about your question yet, Alex. I'll get to it in a second. I'm sorry. It's a little complicated, but I think it'll be cool to show. So then what can we do, right? Say we wanted to animate this or to make this look like After Effects, right? We can just very simply, make a luminance texture, which is going to give us a completely graphic render for the floor. And let's maybe make it like a dark gray or whatever. And then we can take a new texture, make it luminance, and do something like pink or whatever, right? So that we've got, so I stick that on the cloner. And then if I render now, right, the floor is infinite and these are infinite, so that now I have a very 2D look. But what you will notice is that I can kind of, and you can see it better if I turn on you can see that there's depth, right? I can start to see the inside of these, which you might not see in cinema. So something that you can do to fix that is you can just straight cancel the height of the sphere, or the tube, excuse me. But what else you can do is you can use an orthographic camera. And so what that means is if I make a camera here and I look through it, I can change this from perspective to something like top, right? Which is the same as looking in these different views over here, but now it's actually through a camera. And what you'll see is that this orthographic view no longer shows any of that depth, right? So now I don't have any of those different kind of extrusions going down. Let me make sure that I've got more depth here. Yeah, and so I can make this as big as I want, right? If I, for instance, don't look in my camera now, you can see that these things are massive, right? But looking through the camera, it's like, it's basically a 2D view. It's perfectly top down. So yeah, so let's take that a little bit lower, right? And so now I have this animation where I have a very 2D animation with things going through the floor. So I'll take the floor and I'll bop it down a little bit. Wrong way. And if I was to render this, right, I'm going to just get a very graphic looking thing that renders, as you can see, instantly, probably faster than After Effects, you know, with the way that After Effects works, that I now have the power of Mograph to play with. So what might I do on top of this? Let's just keep going for a moment to kind of look at the power of this. Something that I might do is maybe I want to add just a little bit of kind of random oscillation that's happening throughout this. So what I might do is I might take my random effector, I might change the mode to turbulence, I might leave the position there, and what you'll see is that now these guys kind of move, and I can take the animation speed down to like 10, and I'm going to actually increase this so that it's a little bit more. Right, and then I'll come to my cloner and I'll move that back to the very beginning so that it gets smoothed again, and it happens before all this other stuff, or I can even move it there probably. And now I'm getting this kind of oscillation that's happening on top of that, right? And I can maybe add a little bit of rotation as well. So now you can see that I'm getting this like kind of bubbly looking animation that happens really, really easily. And the other thing that we can do here that is worth talking about is, say that I have this setup here that I'm just going to hide for the time being, is now that my Mograph setup, close that, come back here. Now that my Mograph setup is built, I can apply this to a bunch of different systems, right? So I can take something, for instance, like the MoText object, and I can change so that it's, come on, wasn't going. Where is the orientation? Is it here? I can rotate, not that way, this way, right, back to -90. Hello. Whoops, excuse me, can't type. I don't think there's a trick like there is in After Effects. I can make this center aligned. I can maybe make it a bit larger. That's depth. I want height. Right, bam, got that. And then if I come over to this all, because you can actually do, similar to how After Effects lets you do the lines, words, letters, you can add effectors on a lines, words, letter basis, but I want to do it to the whole text. And so what I might even do here is, now look what I can do. I can just take this random effector, bam, got it. But actually what I want to do, I'm incorrect, because I want to do it letter by letter. I can now take this random effector, bam, got it. I can then take this plane effector and this scale effector and the delay effector, and what you'll see now is, look, dude, I just made a whole animation. I just changed an entire animation from being these discs to text in like 3 seconds, right? And how, like, that's just awesome that you can build these systems and then change the brain fart again, I'm sorry, it's late on a Monday. You can build this system and then change it really quickly and change the objects, change the shaders, change the animation. Say you don't want the bounce anymore, really easy, turn off the delay. Say that random is feeling a little wobbly and floaty, turn it off, right? So there's all these different things that you can do here that are going to make this just feel really, really good. Cool. So now we can talk about, yeah, let's just talk about it. We're going to talk about perhaps one of, in my opinion, the most powerful effectors that Mograph has. But it is a little bit more complicated. So we're going to look at this, and please, please, please stop me if you have any questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically start, you know what, actually, I'm going to just take that. Also, this little menu that I keep pulling up is super helpful. The way that you get it is you just hold down V, and you have some different things like tools, plugins, etc. But the really helpful one is projects down at the bottom, and it'll let you switch between which projects you have open. So just by holding V, you can do that, and it's like a really easy way to go between each one. So I'm going to copy actually this cloner setup that I have, so the little discs or whatever, into this new project. And I'll paste it here, and then I'll just make it visible again. So now, right, this is where we were a few minutes ago. There's no effectors or anything animating here as well, but maybe what I wanted to do is affect the opacity of these things as they go. And the way that we do this is through something called the shader effector in Mograph, right? And that lives down here. It's the shader. And what the shader does, and actually let me delete this material. Hold on one second. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I'm just explaining this the right way. We're not going to do it with a shader. We're actually going to do it with the plane effector the same way that we were just doing it. We're going to select the Mograph effector plane, right? And what I'm going to do is, just so that we can see what's happening, is I'm going to set that to 0. I'm going to set Z to like 100, just so that we can see where these things are being moved. And I'm going to do exactly what I had just done before. I'm going to take this thing, set it to -X, and now I'm going to maybe trace that out so it's a little bit longer, right? So just as we can see here, this plane effector is essentially affecting these not at all, right? Or yeah, affecting these not at all, affecting these a medium amount, and affecting these all the way, right? Something that is not immediately apparent in Mograph is that it actually all works off of color channels, right? And you may have noticed that there's this color mode here that that all of the effectors give you, right? So if I click a random effector, there's a color mode. All of them have them. And so what if I can do is I can change this to on, and what you'll see here is that automatically this white got applied, right? And I could do something, and not only is the white applied, but the white is basically applied in that same fall off that we have the position, right? These have no white, these have a little bit of white, and these are full white. And in fact, if I come to fall off and I just make this infinite again, you can see that they all go totally white, right? And so what we're going to do actually is we're going to use this Mograph color value to drive the opacity of a shader, right? And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at this material down here, this pink one that I'm going to put on this cloner again, and you'll see that that covers it up because it's a shader. We're going to look at this pink material, and we're going to basically say, look at the color, the Mograph color of these rings, and base your opacity off of that, right? So black should be totally transparent, and white should be totally opaque. And this is actually not that hard to do, lucky for us. And the way that we do it is, let's just go into alpha, right? Click here. Or you could actually do it, you can do it in transparency if you want to, it doesn't really matter. The difference being between transparency and alpha is almost like a 2D effect, where it just like makes the whole thing invisible to the camera, invisible to the scene, invisible to everything, whereas transparency like makes it like glass, where the object is still there and it still interacts with the world, but you just can't see it. So this will render a little more slowly, but it'll be also look a little nicer. So what we actually want to do here in this transparency, and again, I apologize for jumping around, but if I just to look at how the transparency channel works, I'm gonna got this yellow shader here, right? And if I go to the transparency channel, automatically it goes away. If I turn off specular, it goes away entirely. Right? There's nothing there. But what I can essentially do is, you can see this color here, and as I take this color down, right? Actually, I should do it this way, right? As I take this color down, the amount of transparency changes. So when this is totally white, it's totally opaque, right? Whereas when this is totally black, or if I come down there, it's totally transparent. And you can actually see too that if you change the different color channels, you can do it on a per channel basis, right? So the transparency is only letting through non-blue light, essentially, right? So you can use that to create some cool stuff. But how do we drive this black and white thing through our Mograph color? And what you can see too is that if I add different things here, like an easy one, for instance, is checkerboard, which I think is in surfaces. what you'll see is when I render this, I very much get like where it's black, transparent, where it's white, I get the stuff, right? And so then obviously if you add refraction and stuff, you'll start to see the other bits. You can kind of see it there. But so what we're basically going to do, and I'm going to close this guy, is we're going to basically feed this color amount into our shader, and it's really, really easy. Actually, what you just do is you come down here to Mograph and you say color shader, right? And what that's basically going to do is just say, give me the color of the Mograph clone, right? And so what you'll see is this all renders is nothing at the moment because it doesn't really know. But when I put this material on there, you'll see that this transparency thing is happening, right? Where here, where the white was happening is totally, excuse me, here where the black was happening, if I turn this off, is totally opaque, and the white is totally transparent. So that's not the right way. That's not the way that I want it. So I can do this in two ways. I can flip this to positive X, but that's going to change my my position movement as well. Maybe I don't want that. And so something that you can do is if you click on this color shader, you come to, actually, where do I want to do it? I want to invert it. And there's a way to do that by, let me find it. Is it filter? Yeah, so you can take the filter basically, and then what you can do is you can come here, you can say, you can click on this spline, and you can basically invert it, right? So we want black, what's here is black, negative RGB to be white, and we want what's here, which is currently white, to be black. And you can do that by hand, or I think what you can do is you can, there's a way to say flip, yeah. So then it just flips it there, and now you'll see that basically it's just inverting that color, and now we're getting very little to no transparency, or no transparency over there, and then we gradually come up through. And so this is really cool in that it can allow us to use the color of Mograph as its shader. And so let's look really quickly at some other things that this can do, right? On a very basic level, I'm going to just delete that, I'm going to delete this. On a very basic level, if we click on our random effector and we turn the color mode on in this parameter, we just get random colors, right? Like this inherently is a really useful thing to just get random colors for your clones. The other thing that we can do is instead of using a random effector, this is where I was going before with the shader effector, we can come here, go to Mograph, grab our shader effector, make sure color mode is on. I'm going to turn this off. This just basically, it flattens the alpha essentially. Don't worry about it. Most of the time you're going to want to turn this off. But then what I can do is I can come to the shader channel and I can basically, let me just add, for instance, to be really easy to follow, a gradient, right? Black to white. This is doing exactly the same thing as what we were just looking at before. And in fact, you know, we can just come in here and we essentially, if we invert this, we have what we had before without having to make a fall off because we're just adding a gradient. But what we can do in the shader effector too is we can change the colors, right? So now I'm getting red to blue or something like that, right? And so now I can add these different effects, and then what can I do? I can add turbulence so that I start to get a little bit of randomness, very much like it is there, right? I can change some of these values. I can change one of these guys or whatever, so that basically whatever this look is gets applied to all of these different clones. And so, you know, you can do it with a gradient because it's really easy to see. You can also do it with noise, right? So now I'm getting different variations of black and white. And so if I do bright pink and orange or something, you'll see now, oh, those are too close, my bad. You'll see now that you get this kind of range between them, and as I up the contrast and stuff, I start to get more of that exact stuff. And so what I can do now, right, is presently when I render these, you notice I don't have a shader. When I presently render these, it just has kind of the default basic thing, but I can make a shader that's going to leverage those colors, right? So if I go to color and I say, hey, Mograph, use the color, right? Use the color of the Mograph clone, but then put some reflection on top, right? And we'll just put a Fresnel. It's an old cinema, my bad. But if we take this Fresnel and we, I want this to go down, and then I want to drop the reflection just a little bit. Maybe I'll add a bump, right? Maybe I'll add some noise and take that down to 10% or whatever. And then so if I put this on the cloner, not only am I getting that color, but you can see that I'm also getting that bump. And if I had something that would reflect, I would hope that I would get something that reflects. I have to see. We'll do it live, boys. I have to cram it in there probably to get it to... Whoops. As you can see, right, then I now have a reflection that's going on top of my my Mograph color. So I can use, now it's nice and sharp because I took the bump off. Now I can use this shader effector to assign colors to my Mograph clone. So like one of the biggest things that we talk about is how do I get random colors on my clones, or how do I do something like that. And this is exactly how, right, is you just use that color shader. And I think that, you know, just to demonstrate, again, what I was talking about a little bit earlier, is you'll see if I turn this alpha strength on, it like mutes the colors because it's trying to read orange as like a certain % of alpha, so you can just keep that turned off for the time being. And so this will give you random colors on your clones, right, which is really, really helpful. And we can use this to do lots of different things. So the one thing that then comes up is, it's like, okay, what if I don't want this to be like random? What if I don't want this to be noise? What if I want it to be one of 3 different colors that I choose, right? What if I choose specifically red, green, and blue, and I want them to randomly be that? Well, then we have a way of doing that as well, right? And so what we're going to do is I'm going to come and I'm going to delete this shader effector. I'm going to come to my cloner and come to Mograph, pick a random effector, come to parameter, turn off the position, and turn on this color mode, right? So now I have random colors on my thing. And so if I come back to this shader, actually I'm going to make a new one. If I come back to this shader, turn off color and specular and come to luminance and go down to Mograph, the other one that I have in here that's helpful is I have this multi-shader, right? And if I go to multi-shader, what you can essentially do here is you can just add different things. So let's say this one's pink. I'm gonna add another color here. This one's gonna be yellow. And then I'll add another one. And this will be whatever color, green, right? So now what you're going to see, right, is that if I put this material on there, is what's going to happen is now it's only picking these different ones. And how is this happening? This is happening, and if I delete this so we can see it, it's happening by color brightness, right? So the darkest ones are getting the bottom color, and the lightest ones are happening there. But we can change this to other things, like, for instance, index ratio, right, which is just going to put this on here. It's just going to basically like divide it evenly, right? So you're getting a 1, 2, 3. You can do it like based on something like how much red you have in that, because you know we have a lot of red here, we have some greens, etc. And so I can randomize these colors to be different things like this as well. These also don't have to be colors, right? These can be, I can put a Fresnel there. So one of these gets this Fresnel, one of these gets this gradient, and one of these gets this checkerboard, right? So you can do these things to create lots of different effects. And then again, this is just a shader. So again, layering it on top of each other, you stick it in that layer, you then, whatever, make a brightness contrast and a hue sat, you colorize it, you take the saturation up. Now I've made them all green, right? But I have these different shaders that are behaving underneath there, right? And so just by layering these different components together, you can really use the Mograph and the color inside of Mograph to drive your shaders and to make stuff that's really cool. Nice. We're almost out of time. I'm gonna spend a couple of minutes. I'm sorry, Alex, I didn't get to your X particles question. I'll try and write something up for you at some point this week to show you how to do that. It's not that hard. I have a scene I can send you from work. But I do want to take a minute just to talk a little bit about render optimization. I think we have about 10-15 minutes left, so just bear with me while I can kind of go through this and in Cinema talk about some of the ways that we can make Cinema render a little quicker. Okay, no, I don't want to save that. So let us make a beefy-ish scene at the moment. So what I'm going to do is let's just make some spheres. Mograph, cloner, this guy, object, change it to grid, space these out. Right, I'm sure you've all seen these Grayscale Gorilla tutorials, right? It's pretty straightforward. Maybe I'll... Okay, cool. I don't know why it stops you when you get to the end of the screen on a PC. That's kind of irritating. Now I have all these spheres, Mograph, vector, random effector, change the position, change the scale. Maybe I'll take the size of the sphere down. Maybe I'll also clone in some like platonics because those are faceted and cool. And then maybe I'll do some... I don't know, these guys. Make it a little lighter. And then because I don't have other things, I can set my rotation, right? So now I have this kind of crazy scene with all of these different bits and parts and these crazy floating people. I mean, it's ridiculous. I can't take that seriously. What's some other piece of geometry we can put in there? Let's do a tube, and we'll scale that down as well. So now I have these different things. What I might do here now is what we were talking about before, where I might use a bevel deformer. Do I not have a bevel deformer? I might cry. I thought I had it. No, I don't think I have it. Did I have a different version of Cinema last week or something? That's a little strange. But anyway, you could bevel that, but I'm just gonna bevel this this one specifically because it's got a little bit of a rounding edge there. Right, and then what I might do is I might come here. Just bear with me, I'm sorry, and I might make noise, and I might change the colors. Let's do like some bluish purple. And then what I might do is I might crank the scale so that it's much larger, change the seed, change the type, reduce the octave so that it's smoother. Right now I have this kind of generic bluish thing. Maybe I'll up the contrast just a little bit. Turn off specular. I'll come to reflection. I'll do the same thing that I did before. I'll add my Fresnel. I'll drop this and this to being a little less glossy. Right, and that's going to be my shader. And then what I might actually do just for the sake of complexity is I might make this into a layer shader. I might add a Fresnel here. And let's stick some like crazy color around the outside. Let's stick like a pink. Right, and so now this is pink to black. I'm gonna move this black so that it's far more kind of towards the outside, right? I can't grab it. Right, I'm just getting that little rim of pink, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add this, or screen it, excuse me. So now I've got this blue material that's shiny with this kind of pink this pink Fresnel, and if I render, this is what I get. And presently it's working pretty easy, but that's because I don't have any lights and I have no effects and nothing else on top of it, right? So let's make some lights. What we're gonna do first is let's add a physical sky, right? Which I think we talked about before, is that you can set this to like a realistic time of day, and then if I go to compositing tag, scene by camera, it won't render, but I'll at least be able to see the lighting effects. And if I render this now, you can see that I'm getting a lot of these different reflections and things like that, but my render time is going down, right? I also don't love the way that this looks, so I'm going to try and change the, what's a cool city? Djibouti. Should we try Djibouti? I'm going to look for that magic hour sort of thing. Nice. That looks pretty good, actually. Let me... And you can see here that my render time is just eating up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and make these a little bit closer just so that I can get some more density on the screen, right? So now when I render, I've just got this. Right, I've got some cool effects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a camera, and I'm just going to clone out some light so that I can get some kind of general light. So I'm going to click on my area light. I'm going to move it up here. I'm going to stick it in an array object. I'm going to increase the radius of that array a little bit. Again, this is just essentially just cloning these out in a circle. I might change the amplitude and then the array frequency to move them around a little bit. Right, maybe I'll make them a little bit wider. Not that one, this one. Taller. And I will make them seen by reflection, and I will add area shadows, and I will make them a little bit blue. Or a little bit orange, excuse me. Look back into my camera here. And so now you can see that like my render time is just gone way up. And this is only using the standard render, and I haven't even added GI or anything like that, right? And so there's a couple of things that we can do here to like look at how we can fix this, right? And actually what I'm going to do is, just because we were talking about the physical render, is I'm going to change this to physical. And we'll see how we do here. Something that I will say first is that the physical render is notoriously very slow. Like, it's just kind of heavy and clunky and doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. A lot of times it makes very beautiful images and it calculates light really well, but it is definitely not known for its speed. And so the first kind of tip to talking about how to use the physical renderer is to ask whether or not you need the physical renderer, right? Like, how much is this image going to look better when I render in physical render versus the standard render, one of the other renders? And so the way that you do that, right, is that you make comparisons, right? So what I'm going to do is I showed you guys last week how to put this viewport here. You can also stick your render thing here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my render settings. I'm going to basically make this something small that I can kind of render quickly. So like 640, 360. I'm going to make this look through my camera, and I'm going to set render view. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift R, not when I'm there. I'm going to click over here, Shift R, and this is just going to basically make a render for me, right? Down here in this little viewport. And what we can see by this render is we now have a reference for what it looked like, but when it's done, keep going. When it's done, we also have this amount of time that it took to render, right? So 23 seconds. So if I just change this to standard, straight on, and hit render again, we can now kind of do like a one-to-one comparison about how this standard renderer looks, how much more time it takes, whether or not there's any noticeable visual difference, right? And then what I'm going to say probably is without GI, the physical might actually be a little bit faster, but we're going to enable GI in a second. I'm trying just to keep the render times manageable to be able to go quickly, but what you'll notice, right, is unless we're really getting picky, I can hardly notice a change, right? Like there's a tiny little bit of light spill that changes there, but as a whole, like they look exactly the same. And in this example, right, you're saving 11 seconds by going with the physical render, right? So these kind of render tests are definitely what you need to do before you actually set up your render to finalize, right? But let's look here. and we can look at some of these different settings to see if we can make this physical render a little bit faster. And so the types of different modes that you've got here, and again, I would encourage everyone to right-click this guy and go to Show Help, and it'll show you what the different modes do. But essentially, the short version is that fixed calculates like every pixel of your scene exactly the same way. Adaptive like tries to figure out which parts of your scene require more render power and which parts are easier to render and therefore don't need as much render power, and kind of assigns power based on that way. And then progressive is actually kind of cool. What progressive does is, if I just click render here, is it just like basically shows me a very, very low res preview very quickly, and then refines that image, right? Denoises it, crisps the edges, etc., etc. And so the progressive is actually a way that you can basically see how long it takes your render to get to the quality that you like. And what you can do is, if you twirl this down, is you have different progressive modes, right? So you can say, if I leave this on infinite, it's just going to constantly, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever get better, right? But it's never going to finish rendering. So something that I like to do here is you can say time limit, right? So you can say, give me the best frame you can give me in 15 seconds, right? Half of or a quarter of a minute. So render for 15 seconds exactly and give me the best you can, right? Which is really cool actually, because you know, something that I think this was a Grayscale Gorilla topic at one point, but it's like, if you have half an hour for lunch or an hour, let's say you have an hour for lunch and you have 300 frames to render, right? You could do the math and figure out that like each frame can only take whatever 12 seconds or something like that, right? So you can set it so that when you get back from lunch, you will have the best render that you can get for that amount of time, right? The other thing that you can do is you can change this to pass count. So if you come to infinite and you know that like, okay, and if I render down here, what you'll see is that it gives me the pass number that it's currently on, and you might be able to look at this for a while and say, okay, I don't really notice a difference after pass whatever 6, 7, or 8 or something like that. Wherever that kind of quality starts falling off. Like for instance, if I look at this now, I'm not necessarily seeing a lot of difference happening, and it is a small image, I will admit. But you know, I'm not necessarily seeing a lot of cleanliness, so I probably don't need to go up to past 10 or something like that, right? So I could set this to pass count and then say go to like 5 passes or something like that, right? So these are ways to just like force your render quality to behave in a certain amount of time. But if you don't want to use the progressive and you'd rather use these fixed and adaptives, you basically just have this quality slider here, which you can change based on slow, medium, high, automatic. And so automatic sometimes does really well in that it calculates the image really, really nicely and can like correctly allocate power to different pieces and things like that. But other times it doesn't. But this is basically just a way for you to change the quality of the render. Low was going to be a lower quality render that will render faster. Medium was kind of a standard, and high will take longer but render very accurately, right? And I noticed that I said render accurately, not render well, right? Because the quality of your render is basically things like noise and sharpness and like quality of blur. It's not about like the way that your light looks or the way that your objects are built, right? So always think about what this render quality is actually doing. If you don't have noisy shadows and you're on low, you maybe don't need to go to medium. Maybe rendering on low is just totally fine, right? And so I would say, again, these kind of tests down here are definitely the way to do that. Some other things that you can do as well is if you come into this options guy, there are these are basically the settings that you can render with, right? And so on a very basic level, you can turn off components that you don't want to render, right? So if I don't want to render any transparency, you can turn this off. This is often helpful for when you're making like matte passes and things like that, where you don't need the color, you just need an alpha. You can turn that stuff off, but you also, as you over here on this sort of dude, you have these things: ray threshold, ray depth, reflection depth, and shadow depth. And basically these depth things are basically how many times your light bounces, right? And so presently I'm going to zoom in here. But you can see that like I have a ton of these orbs, right? And not only, like this is a good example up here, not only do I have this platonic, but I have the platonic's reflection in the reflection of this platonic, right? It's like reflectionception, right? And that's because the way that this is built is the reflection light will actually bounce 5 times before it's done calculating, right? And so again, I think you have to ask the question is like, do I need to see this reflected in this, reflected in this, reflected in this, reflected in this, or can I take this down to something like 2, and that's going to speed up my render a lot, and I'm going to get a faster performance, right? So let me come back here, and what we'll see is just by dropping that down to 2, we're going to cut off, 6 or 7 seconds, which might not be a ton. Actually, it's only 2 seconds, right? But it's, or 1 second. But that is also 5%. A little bit less than 5%. We've just dropped our render time by 5%. Then if we take our shadow depth down to 10 and maybe our ray depth down to 10, right? And we can just kind of come in here and play with these settings. I might then go to physical. You can change the different subdivisions there that are happening as well. And so I would say that those are kind of the main ways that you want to optimize your render. The other things that do count, and again, we're kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of speedball through these to make sure that we can get through them, is the complexity of your geometry also matters a lot, right? So if I have something like this sphere, it's not a good example because the sphere is a parametric object, but like the number of polys you have is going to change the way, how difficult your renders are. This is particularly problematic when you have something like an extrude. Let me just make this thing and this thing. And we'll put it in a NURBS object, right? So sweep. And what will end up happening, right, is look how many polys I have here. And, what will often end up happening is this will be like 3, and then, we'll put a bunch of subdivisions in this thing, and we'll try and round it, and so then when we hit editable, I have a ton of polys, and what you can do is you can come up to, where is it? Object information or project information. It'll give you a count of your polys, right? I have 1,200 polygons to make this thing. That just doesn't seem like it's necessary, right? If I then come back here and I change some of my subsettings here in this angle property, like maybe I go up to 8, right? I don't notice a difference. I can't see anything different there, but if I make this editable and then come to project information, you can see I've literally cut my number of polys by 1/3, right? And so I think that, or into 1/3. And so what I would say is that, make sure that when you're building things, you're not adding a bunch of additional polygons that you don't need, especially stuff's back. And what can be difficult is when you're doing stuff with sweeps, you might not notice that like your splines underneath are actually super subdivided, right? If I take this down to 2 and I hit edit and I come to point mode, look how many points that's making. Do I need that many? Absolutely not, right? And so I would say that as you go through each individual thing, you can try and just reduce this number, or in this case increase. And like I might not want to go up too high because I'll end up starting to get kinks and weird corners and stuff like that, right? But if I can go to 8 or to 12 and I don't notice a noticeable difference and it saves me 800 polys for this object, that's a great benefit. A couple more things that I would recommend is get to know 2 things I'd recommend. The first is in these details is you also have samples for your light specifically. This is for the kind of light casting, and then there is in shadows, there's density, and if you turn on shadows, if you turn on certain types of shadows, ray tracing shadows, you have accuracy and samples down there as well. So you can modify those samples on a light per light basis. So if you have big kind of boring lights that are just like point lights or infinite lights that aren't really doing something, you might not need to sample that as much as an area light where you're really trying to like get a reflection or something like that. On top of it, the other things that I would say are again, be aware of your scene and what you need and what you don't. So like, for instance, when you talk about global illumination and ambient occlusion, right? Those are two things that have to do with the way that objects interact with each other, right? Whether they're close to each other and they're casting a contact shadow, or whether there's color that's being bounced by light and things like that. You perhaps, like, if you have very transparent objects, like a ton of glass, you might not need GI on those objects, right? You might not need light bounce on something that's transparent. You know, the same thing is if you don't have any reflections, you might not need super high density light sampling, right? And so one of the other things that I'll just leave you with right at the very end here are get to know these tags in Cinema. So because if you right click on an object and you go to Cinema tags, there's two that are important and they do very different things. The first is the display, which I'm just mentioning that it lets you basically change your shading modes. Like I can change this to lines, right, on a per object basis. So this is only affecting, I think I can even do it for just the tubes, right? I can do it for on a per object basis, but this is just my viewport, right? This isn't actually going to change my render, but what we can do is if we go to this compositing tag, right, we now can do things like, I just don't want this to get shadows, right? Or I just don't want this to receive GI, or I just don't want this to receive AO, right? So going through your scene and using these compositing tags to say, okay, I don't need this thing to reflect, so I'm going to turn off reflection, save myself the render time. I don't have any refraction in my scene, let's turn off refraction, right? This isn't behind something that's transparent, so let's turn off scene by transparency, right? And so it's unfortunately a little bit of grunt work, but it's kind of massaging your samples, as somebody said in Slack before, making sure that as you work in a way that is smart and optimal and kind of as minimalist and as few polys as you can live with. And then on top of that, really going through and just considering, okay, this is just the ground, it doesn't need all this incredible detail. Okay, this is something that's way in the back of the scene, I don't need it to be seen by transparency, etc., etc. So I'm sorry that was kind of rushed there at the end, and that was a bit of a hurried explanation, but please feel free to hit me up or post with your peers in the Slack group. Render time is like the bane of all existences for all motion graphics artists, right? It's just like you got to find ways to kill the time. You got to find ways to be productive. If anyone is interested in like talking about hardware for what you could use, like if you're looking to make computer upgrades for rendering, or if you'd like to build yourself like a little team render system or something like that, I'd be happy to chat about that as well. But I think we're gonna wrap it here. It's 10:45, and so it's getting a little bit late. I appreciate you all for staying around for so long and for listening to me ramble for the last hour and a half. As I said last time, we're gonna do our presentations of our animations and everything next week. We might, depending on kind of where everything is at with everyone, I might extend that another week. I might say that that's going to be due on week 8 instead, just so that people have adequate time to go through and build that. But again, I need to work on my time management apparently, because I feel like I have a lot to say here at the end. But again, please bring in like a process book, right, that has your reference, some of your sketches, some of your pre-process work, as well as any design frames that you've done. And then on top of that, let's do the animations as well. And I think let's as a whole, we can treat this as more of a rough cut, and then we'll do one round of revisions, because I think it is important to get revisions on there before you post something to your site. And yeah, so thanks for hanging out tonight. It was good to see you all and talk to you all again. Please hit me up if you have any other questions. Use the Slack like you guys all have been, and we will chat next Monday with the new animations and process books, and I'm excited to see it. Thank you all very much for attending, and I'll talk to you on Monday.